Well, thank you for joining us for Hamilton the Musical, the webinar. I'm Greg Berry, Assistant Director in the UAB Office of Alumni Affairs. Just a quick disclaimer, since we're meeting virtually, don't be surprised if there are any small glitches or things may seem out of place from time to time. If you have any audio or video issues, click the reconnect button at the top of your screen and you will get back to the webinar quickly. And typically it picks up where you left off, not where we currently are. So that's a bonus for you. Tonight we have the chance to get historical context of the smash hit Hamilton from Dr. Brian Steele. Now, before we get to Dr. Steele, I would like to ask a quick question. Just how familiar are you with Hamilton, the music? Are you someone who hasn't watched it yet but is planning to? You saw it, loved it, and now you're interested and you're just fascinated with it. Or maybe you hum or sing most, if not all, the songs all the time. And perhaps your friends just hate that you know the musical like the back of your hand because you know it word for word. I'll keep the poll up for a few moments so you can submit your answers. At the end of tonight's presentation, we will have time for questions, and we really would like your questions, and we will make this a discussion with Dr. Steele. Be sure to place those questions in the chat box throughout the evening, and I'll make sure Dr. Steele addresses as many as possible. Still have a few more people voting. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and we will take a look at what we have. A majority of you saw it once, loved it, and now you just want to know more, with others saying that friends hate that you know it word for word. Thank you so much for taking part in tonight's poll. Now, tonight we do welcome Dr. Brian Steele. Let me go ahead and get his headshot up here for you. Dr. Steele earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Tulsa before being awarded his PhD from the University of North Carolina. Dr. Steele specializes in American intellectual and political history with an emphasis on the American Revolution and early American Republic. He teaches a variety of courses, which this fall included one, Hamilton the Musical. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Steele. Welcome tonight, and the platform is yours.
Thank you, Greg. I want to thank Claire and Greg both for inviting me to be here with you tonight and for joining me. I think it's a real testimony to the magnificence of Lin Manuel Miranda's art that so many people have signed up to spend an hour on a December Tuesday listening to me, of all people, talk about his achievement. Americans are, deeply divided, as you know, but Miranda has created a musical that somehow everybody loves. What's the secret? That's what I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight. And I'm going to proceed under the assumption that most of you, probably all of you, have some familiarity with the story, with the musical. Maybe you've seen it or certainly have listened to the music. Now it's on Disney Plus, so people can see it, on television. But in case you haven't seen it or listened to the music, this is a spoiler alert. Hamilton does die in the end. He ascends into heaven, accompanied by the accolades of his friends and family and his enemies also. And I'm sorry to spoil that for you, but that is the truth of the matter. And one thing about history is that you kind of know the outcome in advance. You kind of know how things turn out. And the real interesting thing is trying to figure out how we got there. And so that's also part of what we're going to be trying to do tonight. And in contrast with Lin Manuel Miranda, I have very little in the way of props or musical accompaniment, certainly no hip hop. For that, I'd recommend the soundtrack. But I do want to show you a couple of very boring slides just to kick things off. These are all headlines from the New York Times. And so, Greg, if you could show that first one. This is the first slide, headline from the Times: Big Hamilton Show Fails to Draw Crowds. So I want to let that sink in for just a second. You're saying, what? How can the Big Hamilton Show fail to draw crowds? This article is from November 22nd, 2004. And it's describing a $5 million Alexander Hamilton exhibition at the New York Historical Society. which was presented as a kind of blockbuster show. And it was a big show, lots of money, no interest whatsoever, no public interest. The article goes on to say that some historians were pretty critical of the Historical Society's focus on Hamilton, because it seemed to suggest a new conservative bent at the institution, one less in keeping with our democratic values. That was part of the argument that the critics made in 2004. Now, here's a second headline, Greg, if you can put that up. I think I've lost video. Oh, there it is. I can see it now. The second headline, you see that? It says, Secretary Liu announces historic decision to feature a woman on newly designed $10 note. Now, this is from June 17, 2015. The piece explains, in exercising his responsibility to select currency, features, and design, Treasury Secretary Liu, Jacob Liu of the Obama administration, will select a notable woman with a focus on celebrating a champion for our inclusive democracy. And the piece went on to quote Secretary Liu saying this, America's currency is a way for our nation to make a statement about who we are and what we stand for. Our paper bills and the images of great American leaders and symbols that they depict have long been a way for us to honor our past and express our values. So let's think about that for just a second. What Secretary Liu is saying, the clear implication of what he's saying, is that the removal of Hamilton from the $10 bill will be a move in favor of our more inclusive democracy. So things aren't looking too good for Alexander Hamilton, in 2015. Now, do you all know what happened with the $10 bill? Well, here's another article from the Times. The third headline, Greg. I can't really see the screen, but I assume that you've put it up. This is from April 20th, 2016, and it says, Harriet Tubman ousts Andrew Jackson in change for a 20. So what has happened here? They've switched things. And if you look at the fourth headline, Greg, April 15, 2016, the headline reads, Success of Hamilton, the musical, may have saved Hamilton on the $10 bill. So do you know why? Because Lin Manuel Miranda lobbied Jacob Liu to get him to keep Hamilton on the $10 bill. Jacob Liu anticipated that Hamilton's fans would be upset, and so he promised that Hamilton would remain somewhere on the $10 bill. So, this is a really fascinating development. Now, first of all, I should say, if anyone should be on the currency of any of the founding fathers, it ought to be Alexander Hamilton. In fact, it's a sort of great irony that he was scheduled for removal at all. There's arguably no figure in all American history whose portrait ought to grace our currency than Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, who almost single-handedly rendered a debt-ridden United States solvent as if with the snap of a finger. He established the public credit, transformed America almost overnight from a country, kind of crawling hat in hand to Dutch bankers for loans at high rates of interest, into one of the most secure credit risks around. It's an economic.
Hey, Dr. Steele, before you move on, hit your video there. There you go. I want to be able to see you. Perfect.
Okay. I didn't.
You are
hit
good. Nope. Okay, go ahead and continue.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, Hamilton, kind of renders the country solvent, provides sorely needed tax relief to struggling farmers, who had fomented such discontent and threatened the stability of state governments in the 1780s. And his creation of the Bank of the United States gave the country its first national circulating medium, and the whole scheme provided, a pool of liquid capital for the use of mercantile community, whose pecuniary interests he hoped to align with the stability and longevity of the government. So the fact that Hamilton's portrait was ever scheduled for removal from the currency, it just kind of goes to show that you don't need to know very much about American history to run the Treasury Department. Okay, so that's one thing that you don't learn very much about from the musical. And I think that's one of the reasons that Hamilton really is crucially important to American history. But what happened between our New York Historical Society announcement in 2005, when the Institute couldn't drag people to see a show dedicated to Hamilton, the projected removal of Hamilton from the $10 bill, and the development of a fan base that demanded that Hamilton stay on the bill? What happened was that Hamilton had become a superhero. What happened was Lin Manuel Miranda. Lin Manuel Miranda happened to Alexander Hamilton. And so the musical has a great deal to do with his recent popularity. Well, everything to do with it, more or less. But I also want to point out something that we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes. And that's that Hamilton was put back on the $10 bill for reasons that he himself might have found silly or problematic. The wrong historical reasons. Hamilton never really courted popularity. He considered popularity like that ephemeral and empty. And it's kind of one of the delicious ironies of the musical that Hamilton has become, in spite of himself, a celebrity. What he courted was fame, which the founders all distinguished from celebrity or popularity or the fulfillment of ambitions or success. And that's one thing that I want to talk with you about in a few minutes when we, kind of get into the meat of the discussion. But historians have long, known that we should care about Hamilton, and there are, great reasons for that. But he's long been a less compelling figure than many of the other founders. Certainly Jefferson and Washington, and even Adams and Madison. And one of the reasons is that it has a lot to do with how we have thought about ourselves as a nation. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? That's a central question or statement, I suppose, from the play. And part of the message is that history is, maybe created by the way that we remember it. It's too crude to say that history is written by the winners, though that in itself turns out to be generally true. But the real point is well taken, that the past, is sort of everything that's ever happened, and history is what we remember. The history has everything to do then with the questions that we ask of the past, and the questions that we ask about the past are shaped by our present moment. So our current historical understanding is always emerging out of an ever unfolding present in which we're asking questions about our past. Then Hamilton the musical isn't history really, not in the traditional sense. I had a clip that I wanted to show you. You can look this up. It's very brief, about Lin Manuel Miranda talking about the historical inaccuracies in the play. And somebody, asks him, well, look, I read that Angelica, had several siblings and wasn't really, desperate to marry rich and so forth. And in fact, she was even married by the time she met Alexander Hamilton. And he said, well, I forgot about that. And then he went on to talk about the narrative arc of the story. And what was most important to him was telling this story in a way that would be effective and attract audiences and tell the story well. And so, Hamilton's a legislator and administrator. Lin Manuel Miranda is, in a broad general sense, I think, a poet. And in that sense, I'm describing it sort of in the sense that Shelley meant when he said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And I think what Shelley meant by that, at least one thing that he meant, is that poets cultivate the sentiments and the opinions of the public, and they kind of shape the way we think about the world, or reflect it at least to some degree. And this is one reason I think why Hamilton spends a lot of time trying to influence public opinion in his writing. So Miranda right away sees the tragic arc of the story, and he decided to kind of adjust facts as necessary to fit the story that he was telling. But I think it would be super boring and uninteresting to just sort of make a list of all the historical inaccuracies in the musical, and I think that would really miss the point. The musical is extraordinary, as you all know. It's brilliant, and it's quite wonderful in its own way. And I think what I'm more interested in is this question of how is it that we turn Hamilton into somebody that we have suddenly a deep and abiding affection for, someone who we've never really necessarily collectively celebrated in that sort of way before? Now, I don't pretend to be an aficionado of Broadway by any means. Some people have told me that this musical led them to an interest in history. For me, it's almost the opposite. That my interest in this musical and in history led me to think a little bit about Broadway. And Broadway, and this is true of much of popular culture besides, has always been a window into the meaning of America. And it kind of always tends to reflect the changing times and our changing values. It offers escape, it celebrates life, but it also sings the promise of America. And Broadway has often pushed the envelope, but there are limits to that, and it has to generally stays within certain conventions that will sell tickets. And so, however revolutionary this one purports to be, Hamilton, the Revolution, the book, which you can buy. It's very good. It's kind of the libretto, I suppose, the book of the play. However revolutionary this one purports to be, its message is actually pretty conservative in lots of ways, not always by any means, but it tells us a lot about who we are. It tells us about the limits, of theater as well, and it's an interesting musical that is, in some sense, not super offensive to just about anyone. President Obama once said that Hamilton was probably the only thing that he and Dick Cheney could ever agree about. They both really loved the musical, and I think that's interesting. And so I want us to think a little bit about the kind of message that Lin Manuel Miranda is selling. So I want to spend the next few minutes just talking about 4 questions that I have that I hope kind of unpack a lot about the musical. And then I want to leave some time for questions for us to have a conversation together. So the first question I have for you is something I alluded to a few minutes ago, and that is, what is fame? We all know that Hamilton has ambition. In his very first letter, the very first letter that we have recorded from him, November 11th, 1769, when he was 14 years old, he chafes against the status of a clerk. That's what he is right now. And he calls it the groveling condition of a clerk or the like, to which my fortune condemns me. My fortune condemns me to being a mere clerk. And I hate that because I have a great deal of ambition, right? And that comes out in the musical very nicely. And he says, I would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station. I would risk my life to exalt my station. This is the letter that ends with this line, I wish there was a war. He really wrote that, age 14. I wish there was a war, period, end of sentence, end of letter. And I think the implication is clear that if there was a war, he could somehow get out of this situation, distinguish himself. But it's the same thing he says to his father-in-law when he's describing in 1781 how he left Washington's staff in a real huff. And the play doesn't really do a very clear job of explaining what exactly went on there. And it's actually a little bit unclear. I think he just got very offended by something Washington did and left his service. And he says to his father-in-law in a letter, Philip Schuyler, I always disliked the office of an aide-de-camp as having a kind of personal dependence. Hamilton didn't want to be controlled by anybody. He didn't want to be dependent on anyone, and he didn't want to serve anyone. He wanted, he had his own sort of ambition. But what the play does is really nicely is demonstrate or show how Hamilton's ambition, this kind of raw desire to get ahead, to get to be something more than what he is right now, becomes transmuted in a way into what the founding generation called fame. So what is fame? Well, in Federalist 72, Hamilton wrote about why the president ought to be reelectable. One of the many reasons he offers is this: if you exclude a man from eligibility for reelection, you reduce inducements to good behavior. If he's not eligible for reelection, then he won't have as much incentive to be good, to do good things for the public. And he goes on to say this, that reward is one of the strongest incentives of human conduct, but the best incentive is the love of fame, the ruling passion of the noblest minds, which would prompt a man to plan and undertake extensive and arduous enterprises for public benefit. What does Hamilton mean by fame? That public benefit is a real key. Tocqueville, the French, theorist who traveled around America, noticed that Americans had a lot of ambition, but he said that their ambitions tend to not be very lofty. They're not very substantial. Americans want to acquire property, power, and reputation, he said, but they don't have grand plans. They don't contemplate things on a grand scale. And he says they care much more for success than they do for fame. And Tocqueville saw that as a deficiency, but it's certainly something I think you can't say about Hamilton or the founding fathers, generally speaking. And a scholar who wrote about this in the 60s, Douglas Adair, wrote a really brilliant essay called Fame and the Founding Fathers. And he said that the founders were concerned with, the point of fame is that it's concerned with the judgment of posterity. It cares not about ephemeral popularity with the masses. It cares about what the future will think. So it serves to transform egotism into and self-aggrandizement into public service. So the idea is that what you strive for affects your behavior. And if you're striving for fame and you want to have a favorable judgment in the eyes of the future, then you're going to try to steer your ambitions in such a way that it will be good for public for public good. So fame is much more than just trying to be a celebrity. And in fact, celebrity, the founders, and Hamilton, certainly was included here. They thought celebrity was very fleeting, very ephemeral, and not very substantial. And one of the things that's so fascinating about the play to me is that Hamilton is now popular, which is something he never necessarily cared to be, popular with the theater-going masses, right? The democratic masses. What he wanted was fame in the eyes of posterity, people capable of exercising discriminating judgment. That's who Hamilton cared about. So, I'll just skip ahead a little bit and say the worst thing you could say for these guys was, the worst thing you could critique someone for was having ambition that was untempered by virtue, that was not tempered by a search for fame, but was just a kind of search for personal popularity or power for its own sake. And he thought that the office of a congressman or someone in public station would look down with contempt, he wrote, upon any mean or interested pursuit. He said a true congressman seeking fame would not meanly court a temporary importance by patronizing the narrow views of local interest or by encouraging dissensions in the people or in Congress. And he would never be devoted to the service of a cabal, but instead have the integrity of a patriot seeking public welfare. So this is Hamilton writing this in 1778, very early on, and he's very concerned about fame. And this has everything to do with why he has a problem with Burr, and that's what I'm going to talk about at the end of this lecture. So stay tuned for that. I'll skip to my next question, which is this: is Jefferson serious? All right. So in the play, Jefferson played so wonderfully by Daveed Diggs. If I could talk with you and have interaction, I would solicit your description of the Jefferson character. But I'll just sort of fill in some of the blanks for you and say that it seems to me that he's portrayed in a way that's pretty goofy, pretty flaky, effete, sort of nonchalant. He's kind of a fop, right? And he seems the polar opposite of Alexander Hamilton in the play. Jefferson seems like an aristocrat, very secure in his position. He doesn't need to be scrappy and hungry. Jefferson in this play, and probably in real life actually too, has never been hungry. And he never stays up all night writing like Hamilton does. And Hamilton did do that. And he was capable of writing a 25 or 50 page treatise overnight and dumping it on George Washington's desk the next morning if he was asked. Jefferson never stays up all night writing like it's going out of style or like he's running out of time, because Jefferson had all the time in the world. Now, my suggestion here, and this is probably the most ridiculous thing I'll say all night, is that the play turns on Jefferson's being fundamentally unserious. Partly this is a traditional Federalist reading of Jefferson. Somebody who drunk so deeply of French philosophy, that's a quote from Hamilton, by the way, drunk so deeply of French philosophy that he no longer sees straight, and he kind of spends his days dreaming of utopian projects, like trying to sort of extract energy from moonbeams and that sort of thing. This is the kind of thing Federalists would write about Jefferson. Hamilton, in real life, though, took Jefferson very seriously, and you don't get a great sense of that in the play. Why they were very wary of one another. It seems like a kind of personality conflict in the play, and certainly I think there was personality conflict, but there's something fundamentally more serious going on. And I think the function of turning Jefferson into somebody that's kind of unserious is that Hamilton can embody many of the values that we traditionally associate with Jefferson. So yes, I said it, and I said this is going to be kind of ridiculous, but I think, and I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but I think it's true that much of what we really like about the musical is its celebration of Jeffersonian values, not Hamiltonian ones. When the book of the play claims that Alexander Hamilton, and that's in this book I showed you a minute ago, fought to make it easier for people like him to travel as far as their talent would take them, it really is describing Jefferson. But Jefferson's obviously very problematic for us now because of his equivocations on slavery and his racism. So it's difficult for us to take his democratic radicalism as seriously as we perhaps ought to do. Hamilton, cared about establishing institutions because he thought you couldn't trust the virtue of the people, who tended to get carried away with passion and didn't have a sufficient stock of reason or knowledge to guide them. So they needed what he called political pilots to guide them, to keep them steady and within proper bounds. Hamilton's speech in the Constitutional Convention, by the way, which is very celebrated in the play, is really a denunciation of what became the Constitution. It's a celebration of the British form of government. It's a call for a more or less permanent upper house and an elective monarchy. And for good measure, he wrote, nothing but a permanent body, a kind of aristocracy, can check the imprudence of democracy. Talk about indelicate. What I'm going to say may sound indelicate. Yes, that is indelicate, Alexander Hamilton, in America, to talk about a permanent body checking the imprudence of democracy. So Hamilton is a much more complex figure, I think, than the play lets on. Jefferson cares about institutions too, but his solution was not to have political pilots to guide and shape the people, but to cultivate a capacity for self-government in the people themselves and to keep the revolutionary spirit alive in the people themselves. Hamilton came to New York as a result of patronage from a sponsor who recognized unique promise in this boy who could write and administer a trading office. And that's how people rise up in an aristocratic society. Jefferson wanted to make that sort of opportunity available to everyone, insofar as they were capable. Get rid of all artificial distinctions or barriers to achieving our highest capabilities. Jefferson said, nature, and this is a quote from him partly, nature has sown genius as liberally among the poor as among the rich. So in most societies, genius sown among the poor, basically remains dormant. It doesn't flourish and grow because it's stifled. And, the poor remain poor, and there's never given an opportunity to rise up. So this is the origin of Jefferson's plans for public education at the public taxpayer expense, and his commitment to freedom of conscience, his commitment to access to public information, so that everyone can rise up to the level of their capacity, and so society can take advantage of their talents. Jefferson is relatively hostile to tradition and to legacies as an inhibition on the freedom of future generations. So his stance is always against artificial barriers or encumbrances to people's activity. So he declared himself hostile to every form of tyranny over the mind of man. He thought laws and constitutions were not, as he put it, like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched, but they would develop and grow as human society evolved. And that it was as silly to expect human beings to keep the same laws and customs and interpretations of constitutions for all time as it would be to force a man to wear the same coat that fit him when a boy. And he trusted future generations would be as wise as we are and make adjustments to fit their laws and their institutions to the new things that they would learn about the world. And so I think Jefferson, in a way, offers us the most capacious and democratic kind of national story because it's always becoming itself in an effort to not be a disappointment to itself. And this becomes an ethically constitutive story that is the basis for collective solidarity. It's a narrative of civic belonging. His declaration says Americans reflexively believe that all people are created equal, and his word calls to practice ourselves better. So it's ironic that Hamilton, who once wrote, "This American world is not made for me," is sort of made to be the kind of embodiment of Americanism. And in one of his final letters, Hamilton wrote, "Our real disease is democracy." But he becomes the hero of a play about equality and access to power. Now, I think it's all very complicated, but I just throw this out at you so that you will see that Jefferson is a lot more complex figure maybe than the play wants to let on. I think the Jefferson figure in the play is wonderful. I think that Daveed Diggs' portrayal is so extraordinary, and you just love it, and it's hilarious. It makes me laugh. My favorite line in the whole play was apparently a Daveed Diggs improvisation that made its way into the actual thing, into the actual lyrics. When Madison says, I've been fighting for the South alone. Where have you been? And he says, France. It's so funny to me. I laugh every time. I laugh even when I say it out loud. So I crack myself up. But I think one really good way, I think this is very helpful for me, and maybe it will be for you too, because I think what we are now is a kind of product of Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian ideas about how we need to operate ourselves. And it's not very easy to call yourself either Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian today. You kind of have a merger of them. I think if you think about liberty, not as some kind of abstract concept, but as a sort of midpoint between despotism and oppression on one hand and anarchy and licentiousness on the other, then Hamilton and Jefferson put liberty at different places along that trajectory. So Hamilton would be much closer to this line that leads toward despotism and oppression because he was interested in order and stability. Jefferson puts liberty a lot closer to what we would call, or Hamilton and the founding generation would call, anarchy or licentiousness. As much liberty as you can have consistent with stability and order. Hamilton wants as much order and stability as you can have, consistent still with liberty. So he was a Republican, wasn't interested in despotism or oppression by any means. But that, I think, helps me understand kind of where they are and why they're at odds with each other. I'll just say as a note really quickly, because I've got other things to say. But on immigration, which is something that's very important in the play, precisely because immigration is so important to us now. One of the biggest lines, I think, applause lines that the play gets is when Lafayette and Hamilton say, "Immigrants, we get the job done." Now, it's such an interesting line, and it's for obvious reasons. It makes a big splash, for audiences, and for good reasons. But Hamilton came from Nevis and St. Kitts and was not really an immigrant, so to speak, in the way that we think of immigrants now. Lafayette certainly wasn't an immigrant to the United States. He was a French soldier who fought in the Revolution for that cause. But even more ironic, it's the Federalist Party, Hamilton's party, that works really hard to limit immigration and make it hard for people to get naturalized, precisely because the immigrants in the 1790s all tended to vote for Jeffersonian candidates. So that's another kind of irony in the play that I think is fun to think about. Okay, not by any means to dismiss the play, which I again think is extraordinary. I think I'm going to have to skip my third question, which is actually a very important one, and I don't want to skip it, but maybe I'll pick it up in the question and answer session. And it's the question is, why is George Washington black? This is a very important question, and I hate to push it off, but I think I'll ask you instead, wrap up by saying, who is Aaron Burr, and why does he keep showing up in this play? Burr kills Hamilton, as we know, and Miranda makes him the narrator, which is fascinating on a number of levels. The line, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, becomes kind of wistful in Burr's mouth, in the story that Miranda tells. He seems to be referring to Hamilton, whose life story was more or less defined or told by his political enemies, certainly, who eventually triumphed. But Burr himself wrote almost nothing. And his story has been told more or less exclusively by his enemies. So it fits Burr even better than Hamilton. Burr is a very interesting character, all sorts of interesting things about him. It's always fascinating to me to contemplate the fact that Burr's grandfather was Jonathan Edwards. That's referred to in the play. But Jonathan Edwards, probably, arguably the greatest American philosopher / thinker, one of them at least, certainly a fascinating preacher, minister, and Aaron Burr is his grandson. Burr is an unusual character. He wrote in code, almost never committed his ideas to paper. Senator William Plummer once said that Burr's habits have never been to trust himself on paper if he could avoid it, and when he wrote, it was with great caution. I think it's Gordon Wood that said the other founders left volume after volume of letters. Jefferson's papers run so far, and they're not finished, to some 42 volumes. Hamilton's 26, Washington's 63, Madison's 38 and counting, Franklin 41 and counting, Burr 2. And those volumes, 2 volumes of papers, in the words of Ron Chernow, are mostly full of gossip, tittle-tattle, hilarious anecdotes, racy asides about his sexual escapades. Chernow has incredible insight with this sentence. Whereas Hamilton was often more interested in policy than politics, Burr seemed interested only in politics. Burr once told his law clerk, "Things written remain." Now, that's a fascinating statement. You remember, one of the things that Lin Manuel Miranda finds fascinating about Hamilton is that he's a writer, and that what he writes is going to remain for the future. And all these guys wanted us to be reading the things that they were writing. They had an eye to posterity. Burr, no. He burns his correspondence. He doesn't want this stuff to be seen. And the musical uses the idea positively, but for Burr, it's a warning. Don't write things down. They can be used against you. So Burr does not really play a major role in Hamilton's life. He comes in and out. Only a handful of references in Forrest McDonald's biography. He's much more prominent in Chernow's. And he's interested in the weird coincidences of their lives. And Miranda picks up on that and uses Burr to great effect as a foil against which to read Hamilton. But again, why are they there, at this duel at the end of their life? Why does Burr kill Hamilton? Remember, Hamilton has ambition. He wants to get ahead. He's young, scrappy, and hungry, but not by any means. He wants to get ahead, not by ways that are dishonorable and would damage his character. Even when he was 14, he says, I want to get ahead, but only in ways that wouldn't be damaging to my character. If you fast forward let me just put it this way. Hamilton had incredible integrity in public affairs, and he was very concerned to avoid any appearance of impropriety. He wrote to Henry Lee, who asked him for information that he could possibly use for financial gain. He said, look, suspicion is always eagle-eyed, and we've got to be above suspicion. We have to have integrity. And he turns down offers to make money. Why? Because he said there must be some public fools who sacrifice private to public interest at the certainty of ingratitude. Because my vanity whispers I ought to be one of those fools and ought to keep myself in a situation best calculated to render service. So this is a reminder of Hamilton's desire for fame, not just ambition to make money, to climb, to get ahead, but to become useful, to become great in the eyes of posterity, secular immortality. And this is a very serious, business for the founding generation, for Hamilton in particular. I think it helps us make a lot of sense of the Reynolds pamphlet. The accusation that Hamilton faced when he wrote the Reynolds pamphlet was public corruption, using his public office for private advantage. And Gordon Wood puts it this way: in order to explain why he had paid money to a Mr. Reynolds in 1791, he had to reveal that he had had an affair with Mrs. Reynolds and that Mr. Reynolds was blackmailing him. So Hamilton sacrificed his reputation for private virtue and hurt his wife deeply rather than allow his reputation for public virtue to be tarnished. So Hamilton thought, and I think you might miss this in the play, Hamilton thought the Reynolds pamphlet was an exoneration. The play makes it seem like a private downfall. He's never going to be president now. But the song kind of misses the point that he couldn't really be useful at all in the future if he was understood to be corrupt with public funds. So Hamilton knows this is a salvaging of his public reputation. A man who would so deeply sacrifice his own private happiness in service to the public, well, that's a man that you can trust. That's the definition of this Republican disinterestedness and the essence of fame. This is a man you can trust, somewhat paradoxically, given our own concern for private morality, but certainly someone you can trust with public business. Now, if you shift to Burr, what does the play show us? What do the founding fathers think about Burr? I'll note one single line, and just to say this: during the election crisis of 1800, Hamilton went out of his way, above and beyond, to make sure that Jefferson, his deepest political enemy and a man he ought to hate, win the presidency over Burr. He wrote letters to his friends in the House of Representatives, and he said, look, you've got to choose Jefferson over Burr. I've always gotten along well with Burr personally. Of all people I should hate, it should be Jefferson. But you have to choose Jefferson over Burr. And the essence of his case against Burr is this. It's summed up in this line from his letter to James Bayard, January 16, 1801. Let it be remembered that Mr. Burr has never appeared solicitous for fame. Never appeared solicitous for fame. Burr had ambition that was unchecked by principle or the love of glory. All of the other founders, Jefferson included, cared about the judgment of posterity. And Hamilton said Jefferson cares about that too. So he's kind of in the brotherhood of founders. Even though I hate him, and even though we're mortal sort of enemies, I know he's not going to burn down the house in order to achieve his own ambition, because he cares about something more than just getting power. And that's something that you don't know about Burr. You can't count on Burr. Burr, he wrote earlier in his life, is our embryo Caesar. Our embryo Caesar. Caesar in the womb. You can never trust Burr. So that is where I'm going to stop now, because I want to leave some time, for your questions. And I do want to read one very brief quote from YIP Harbour, who was the lyricist or librettist, The Wizard of Oz, Finian's Rainbow, a great writer for Broadway. And he said something I think is very nice. A song can degrade your culture, debase your language, can pollute your air and poison your taste, or it can clear your thoughts and refurbish your spirit. It is the pulse of a nation's heart, the fever chart of its health. Are we at peace? Are we in trouble? Are we floundering? Do we feel beautiful? Do we feel ugly? Are we hysterical, violent? Listen to our songs. I think that's a really nice statement. I think it applies to Hamilton, the musical. Thank you.
Very, very well done, Dr. Steele. And with that, let's get right to the questions. The first one's kind of a combo. How was the American newspaper of the 18th century the embodiment of the ideals of Hamilton and the Revolution? And what does Simon Newman have to say about the festive culture of Hamilton and the Revolution?
Well, Simon Newman talks about popular festive culture in the early Republic. His book is right up here somewhere, and he has his work really emphasizes the public. One of the things that this question I think gets at nicely is that this play focuses basically exclusively on the founders themselves, right? On the great men. So it kind of has a great man theory of history. And one of the things that's nice about this question and about Simon Newman's work, and about a lot of work, frankly, in the early Republic among historians, is this focus on, the public. What are the people saying? Because the founders themselves can't do this sort of thing alone, and they're constantly having to appeal to a public that is allowing them to sort of make these sorts of decisions. I mean, after all, if it's a republic governed by the people, then the representatives and executive have to be responsive on some level or other to that public. And that's one thing that differentiates or distinguishes Jefferson from Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison, is they thought the people should be a much more regular and actively involved in shaping government activity. Hamilton and Washington thought that once they were elected, once the people elected their representatives, that the people should basically, be quiet and listen and obey the authority. And that's something that put Jefferson and Hamilton at odds with each other. Washington too, eventually.
How would you say that Hamilton and the Founding Fathers' thoughts on fame compares to how modern politicians view the power of popularity?
Well, that's it's a wonderful question. I mean, it maybe it answers itself. I think it's a very different world that we're in now. And I think one of the things the play does really nicely is it does remind us of a time, or of an ideal, at least in our political culture, that valued, the sacrifice of private pecuniary interest in the service of public good. And that's an ideal that I think we should continue to strive for. I think that, if you really want to get into this, you should read the correspondence between Jefferson and Adams, because they had this conversation. Jefferson was very trusting of the public. He thought that a public that was adequately and sufficiently cultivated by education and access to information, like he desired, would be able to pick out the virtuous and the talented, the real statesmen, from those who were merely celebrities or merely popular. And John Adams replied to him and said, look, what are the characteristics of aristocracy? Wealth, birth, beauty, talent, and virtue. And he said, the first three will always triumph in the eyes of the general public over the latter two. Now, Jefferson thought that was pretty cynical, but Adams's point was that the people would have a lot of trouble differentiating between those various talents, and that any of those things might, in fact, give a person access to popularity and allow them to be elected in a republic. And the question of how, in a democracy, you can ensure that the virtuous and talented will be elected and get access to positions of power and authority, which is, after all, certainly what we all want, right? How do you ensure that in a democratic society is a question that was an open one for the founding generation just as much as it is for ours today. They were very concerned about that question and didn't quite fully know the answer to it. And some of them worried a great deal about it. Hamilton, not least among them. He thought democracy was probably going to kill us in the long run.
In the Federalist Papers, Hamilton defended the Electoral College by saying that it would make it impossible to elect a president who is unsuited to the office.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments of how the Electoral College has changed from those views?
So that's a wonderful question. What is that? Federalist 68, I think. He says, it's incredible to read. First of all, Hamilton says, well, look, of all the things that we did in the Constitutional Convention, we at least did one thing right, which was create this electoral college. Isn't that remarkable? You know, like he was saying, this is a wonderful instrument for electing the president. And after all, figuring out how to choose a president was a really difficult decision at the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't easy to figure out. And there's an extraordinary article about this in the Journal of American History from the 1970s. And I think it's very helpful. I can send the, Greg, the link to it if anybody's interested. But back to the actual question, what that paper, Federalist Paper 68 says. This is another book I recommend. Hamilton's Writings, the Library of America volume. Extraordinary. I mean, it's just chock full of wonder. But this, what he says in Federalist 68 is that the Electoral College is great because it'll ensure that there will never be foreign interference in our election. That's one. That'll make that impossible. Two, it'll make it almost impossible to ever elect a demagogue. Somebody that's just a celebrity rather than a real statesman of virtue and talent, as the question said, and it'll make it basically impossible that someone not generally respected and talented will ever get into public office as the president. Talent for low intrigue, he says, and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union, or of so considerable a portion of it as would be necessary to make him a successful candidate for the distinguished office of President of the United States. It will not be too strong to say that there will be a constant probability of seeing the station filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue. Now, the question really was, though, about, as I understand it, about how that's changed. I think there are a lot of things that are different about it now. The expectation at that point was that the people would, the states would choose the method of choosing electors. The people would somehow, in some way, be responsible for choosing electors, and these electors, who would be men of stature and talent in local communities and states, would meet together and deliberate and talk with each other about the presidential candidates, and they would cast their votes for two candidates that they thought would be best for presidential candidates. And it wasn't just because they didn't trust the people to make these decisions. It was because, communications being what they were in transportation, it was generally impossible for somebody from Georgia to have any sense at all of a candidate who was running for this office from, say, Connecticut. So it was just a matter of kind of filtering the decision-making process. And the idea was that these electors would get together and deliberate among themselves. And the expectation was that a lot of these elections would go to the House of Representatives, where the real representatives of the people could deliberate together about who would be the best president, the one with the greatest reputation for knowledge and talent and cosmopolitanism and virtue, and would be best capable of leading the public. These are the guys that would know who that was. And so they thought that that would be a great way of electing the president. Now, the Electoral College is basically a proxy for the popular vote. And so its function as a kind of filtering mechanism for choosing and deliberating about who the president's going to be is basically gone. So that original conception that they had, that it would actually serve to filter out, as he puts it, men of low intrigue, men of just ambition and that want to demagogue the people into getting elected president. That check is now absent, precisely because our sense of democracy has expanded so dramatically. So a lot of the original, wonder for Hamilton of the Electoral College is gone. I think it still is a representation or an embodiment of our federal system, because it basically is the states, representatives of the states, deciding or choosing, who is going to be president. So it's not a strict popular vote. The states are still, integral components of that decision. And that's something that Hamilton and even people like Madison didn't like back then. They wanted it to be by popular vote. in a certain sense. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
I do want to be respectful of your time. Do you have
I'm willing to stick around, however long people want to talk. So.
Okay, we'll continue on then. Miranda sought to convey a message of inclusion that is often missing in the founders' intent. How can we use the actual narratives from our founders in today's emerging issues of inclusivity? That is
a really nice question. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to say earlier that's a great question. I might want to, I don't know if I might want to answer that by just backing up a second and pointing out that maybe it'll be helpful if I say it this way, that the musical has received some criticism because I'm kind of getting to an answer to that question, but it might take me a second. The musical has received some criticism for the fact that which you don't really even notice. I mean, I'm sure you all have noticed it because you're bright people, but I'm telling you, it does go over your head sometimes that there are no black characters in the play. And the reason you don't notice it is because most of the actors are black or people of color. And so you don't really notice that there aren't any actual historical trying to do here is super fascinating. So that's a criticism of the play. In fact, one scholar has even gone so far as to say that these guys are sort of playing whiteface in a certain sense on stage. And he thinks it's a very bad thing. I think what my interpretation of this is that it is much more generous. I think if you read the book of the play, you'll see several moments where this idea of the blackness of the actors themselves is raised to the level of a kind of conscious principle. And what do I mean by that? So if you look at the place purports to be. Well, it says it's a story about America then, told by America now, right? So it's the present telling the story of the past, as I talked about earlier. Now, on Chris Jackson, the character, the actor who plays George Washington, the book says, when he makes that brisk, bold entrance, a black man striding straight down stage, slamming his sword into a scabbard, the thought crosses your mind. Is Chris somehow getting all of these people to cheer for George Washington himself? Very interesting question. Let me. Do you have time for me to talk about this for a second?
Sure do. Yes.
Okay, great. Because just a second here, if you look, this is on page 149 of this great book about the musical. It's talking about David Diggs, who says this. Seeing a black man play Jefferson Madison when he was a kid in Oakland might have changed his life. And here's a quote from Diggs. A whole lot of things I just never thought were for me would have seemed possible, he says. Even now, the show is changing him, making him feel more American. I always felt at odds with this country, he says. You can only get pulled over by the police for no reason so many times before you say, F this. Now, then he goes on to say, so in other words, and let me point out one more great line. This is from the same book. Leslie Odom Jr., who plays Burr, he says the same thing. Playing a founding father has made him feel newly invested in the country's origins, something that had always seemed remote from his life as a black man in America. Now, I think that's a really extraordinary statement, and I want to kind of unpack it. You can be critical of it, and scholars have been. Lyra Monteiro has written a book. Not a book, but an article about this on the race-conscious casting, and she's quite critical of the move that this makes, because it seems like what she's saying is that if you ignore if there aren't any black characters, it allows you to basically give the founding fathers a pass, because you don't have to wrestle really with questions of slavery and race in the musical at all, even though there are oblique references to it. But I have a more generous reading of it. I really think it has a civic purpose, not, to ignore the problem of race and slavery, but to make it possible for us to take the national project, seriously again in a kind of what I call post-ironic way, kind of make non-white people feel invested in the founding. I think this is getting to the question that was asked of me a few minutes ago. Feel invested in the founding retroactively. And I think, is that good history? That's a good question. Is it good civic education? Yeah, I think it probably is. So the question is, is Hamilton certainly has an inclusive message? Is it radical or revolutionary on race? Well, Broadway generally tells America what it wants to hear. It reflects contemporary standards and tastes. There are moments when it pushes the envelope, but it kind of does so gingerly. The basic message of Hamilton is the message of like My Fair Lady, right? Which is basically the message that Broadway has always sold, which is the American dream. Dreams come true to those who begin with disadvantages, and through a combination of goodness and forbearance and luck, the person triumphs in the end. It's a Horatio Alger story. This is America, and Broadway is always telling that story. I basically stole that from a great scholar of Broadway named Bill Messenger. That's something that he talked about Broadway. But there are moments, when Broadway's challenged that story, like West Side Story, for example. And regardless of the historical period, I'm trying to answer the question. Regardless of the historical period recreated in the show, the time is always here and now. In other words, the audience is sitting there, and no matter what the historical period is on stage, the moment in which the audience is experiencing that play is right now. And the paradox of the musical is that it's an escape from reality. I'm also stealing this from Bill Messenger, by the way. Also, it's escape from reality while simultaneously confronting us with it. So audiences are watching would rarely encounter such experiences themselves, but when they're faced with them on stage and see them recreated, they begin to understand that they're reflecting some kind of reality in America itself. So what message is Hamilton selling? It's a kind of conservative one. You can make it in America if you work hard. Does the race-conscious casting challenge that in any way? If you think about Black Lives Matter or Ta-Nehisi Coates and his argument about reparations, one of the things that, and I assign Ta-Nehisi Coates to my students in my Hamilton class because I want them to think about this question. His argument is that even the hardest working, hardest striving African Americans were prevented from rising up, precisely because they were legally and structurally prevented from doing so. If Hamilton really was Black or Latino in that era, in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, chances that he would have made it to the same status are slim to none. And as a one of my advisors used to say, Slim just left town, so it's pretty much none. So Hamilton's success in some fundamental ways depends on his being white. This is a silent truth that we never really confront usually, but it's one of the most important things about the founding fathers, that they're white. And so it's possible to argue that the play ignores that, but it's also possible to argue, I'm still answering the question, it's also possible to argue that the play confronts us with it by forcing us to think about it. When we see the founding fathers as Black, it forces us to think about all the assumptions about race that are embedded in our own understanding, not only of our national history and politics, but the world itself. And I think that is potentially a transformative sort of message. And so I tend to read Lin Manuel Miranda as really smart and thoughtful on this issue. And I don't know if that fully captured everything that was in that thoughtful question, but that's my briefish reply to it.
And we can go on and on and on. I'll wrap it up with this last question, just so you can go be with your family on this Tuesday night. What are your thoughts on the inclusion of Lafayette in the play, but the exclusion of von Steuben, who arguably helped the army go from a militia to a real army capable of winning the war?
Well, von Steuben, he couldn't even really speak English except swear words. I guess that would go well in this play. A lot of swearing, and the soldiers loved von Steuben, and partly because you swore all the time. But I don't know the answer to that question. I guess Lafayette is a much more maybe elegant sort of character than von Steuben. Von Steuben's aristocratic heritage is a lot more dubious, for example, and he's much less sophisticated in a certain way. And I guess I would also argue this, to be fair, to be more serious. Lafayette remained friends with Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson until their deaths. I can't tell you. So I think Hamilton. I mean, I can't tell you why Lin Manuel Miranda picked Lafayette. It's just that he's a more prominent figure in the long trajectory of this story that goes from the Revolution to the early Republic. Von Steuben sort of falls out before that story is over, so Lafayette can come back into it. If you read Washington's correspondence, for example, this is quite fascinating to me, actually. If you plow through it, you're reading along, and Washington's actually a great writer, and it's really, really instructive to read. But when you hit a letter he writes to Lafayette, it's almost physically different. Like it is so affectionate, and his guard is down. He's playful, goofy, telling sort of inside, partly risque jokes. They loved each other, I don't think that's an answer to the question. You'd have to ask Lin Manuel Miranda why he didn't put in von Steuben. He probably didn't know who von Steuben was. I'm not sure he plays a role in the Chernow book that Lin Manuel Miranda used. But you were right to point out that von Steuben is a really important character in the history of the American Revolution. If you want to read a little bit about von Steuben, look at Charles Royster's book, A Revolutionary People at War, which is a history of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And there's a really wonderful little section on von Steuben and his importance to the Revolution. We didn't even really talk much about the Revolution. You don't get a great sense of what the Revolution is about in this play, but it works okay.
Dr. Steele, thank you so much. Incredible insight into the musical. It's been a fun hour plus with you, and we truly appreciate you having you on tonight.
Thank you. I had a good time, and thanks for these good questions. Appreciate the time.
You're so welcome. Well, be sure to join us for other virtual events coming up. As we start the new year, we will host From Penguins to Plankton, Impacts of Climate Change on Antarctica with Dr. Jim McClintock on January 12th. Then on January 21st, we will take a look at how artificial intelligence holds the potential to revolutionize libraries and information work during AI and libraries. Then on February 4th, we will get interactive as part of This Body Doesn't Do Yoga, as we discover how to make yoga part of your daily routine and discover how reliable health information we find online is. On February 18th, during Health Literacy, finding information that you can trust. You can register for all of these at alumni.uab.edu/events. We also encourage you to listen into our podcast, UAB Green and Told. New episodes are released every other week with conversations from members of the UAB community. Find and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and iTunes, or visit alumni.uab.edu/Green and Told. And be sure to stay on top of all things alumni on social media. We are at UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also look us up on LinkedIn by searching UAB Alumni Career Community. Finally, if you want more information about the UAB National Alumni Society, visit us at alumni.uab.edu or email alumni@uab.edu. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's discussion with Dr. Steele. Happy holidays, and as always, go Blazers.